Now we're going to continue looking at the causes of World War II by introducing probably the most famous character of this war, and maybe even the most famous character of the 20th century, obviously in a bad way, Adolf Hitler. We're looking at Hitler's rise to power in this recording and what his aims were, how he started to achieve them, and some of the events that took place in the early 30s as Hitler gained control of the country of Germany. Let's start by looking at the bottom of 111. Winston Churchill, who was the leader of Great Britain during the Second World War, is seen as not only a great leader of his country, but also a historian. He wrote many books about different events in the 1900s, and he wrote a book called The Second World War, Volume 1, The Gathering Storm. And in that book, he basically asserted that Hitler was on a plan bent on dominating all of Europe, especially Eastern Europe, and that he was going to create this great German empire. He pretty much calls World War II Hitler's war, and in Churchill's eyes, there would not have been a World War II, or it would have been much different, or delayed even, if Hitler had not been present. If you look at the top of page 112, Churchill basically pinpoints the year 1935 when Germany rearmed and militarized the Rhineland as the point of no return. And at that point, the war was the only way to stop Hitler from his ambitions. Taking a look at the background of Adolf Hitler, it's maybe easy to understand why he had the plans and goals that he did. He was an Austrian by birth and fought in World War I on the German army. He was wounded and recovering from those injuries when he learned of Germany's surrender and the signing of the armistice. That angered him so much that that's when he decided to use the next part of his life to try to avenge the losses of Germany and to enter politics to do so. We need to revisit again the position that Germany was left in following World War I. We've mentioned before that the Germans did not feel themselves as being defeated. There had never been a significant land invasion of Germany during World War I, and the Germans had been successful on the Eastern Front against the Russians. When they signed that separate agreement with the Russians called the Brest-Litovsk Treaty in 1917. At that point, the Germans had dominated much of Eastern Europe. They had gained significant territory. But when the defeat on the Western Front came, all those gains were pretty much eliminated. But after World War I, with all the other treaties that were being signed, such as the Treaty of Saint Germain and Trianon, the grounded empires of Europe had been broken apart, like the Russian Empire and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And so still, Germany was left in a pretty good position, and that was something that was mentioned back in Chapter 4 with the different views of these different treaties, that comparatively, Germany was still in a somewhat strong position in Central Europe, with these other empires falling apart. But still, the German people saw the treaty as a slap in their face because they didn't consider themselves truly defeated. And so that idea of wanting to reverse the settlement, that anger and frustration and bitterness towards the Allied powers of World War I was still present among the German people in the years afterwards, and even into the 1930s leading up to World War II. Most German people did not want to see the terms of the treaty completely followed through, and they wanted to regain what they felt had been taken from them, especially certain territories like Poland. They wanted to stop paying the reparations, and so they had some definite goals that they wanted to see achieved, that they weren't going to give up. And this is what Hitler was able to use in his development of the Nazi Party ideals. Pretty much the Nazi Party itself was shaped by the outcome of World War I. When Hitler joined the party in 1919, he was able to work his way up the ladder of prominence to one day becoming the Führer of Germany. The Nazi Party, if you look in the middle of 112, started as simply the German Workers' Party, and then it was renamed to the National Socialist German Workers' Party in 1920. In 1921, Hitler became the leader of this party, so he started from obscurity as a simple foot soldier in World War I and gradually worked his way up in politics to become the leader of this party. But it was not yet the dominant party in German politics. But they did nail down what their objectives were going to be, and you can see these in the middle on page 112. And these objectives were basically the union of all Germans, which would be something that would have to be addressed with the treaty settlements from World War I, because those treaty settlements took certain territories away from Germany and awarded them to other countries, even though those territories had German-speaking peoples in them. So that's one objective of the Nazi Party. They also wanted to end the Treaty of Versailles, which makes sense. They wanted to create Germany a very powerful state once again, like it had been before World War I, after they had defeated the French in the Franco-Prussian War. They wanted to create a national army, which was something that was prohibited by the Treaty of Versailles, and to exclude Jews from German society. We know of Hitler as promoting the Aryan race. He was definitely dead set against the Jewish people because he saw them as traitors to the country, because many Jewish politicians had signed the armistice and the Treaty of Versailles, and he felt like they were pretty much working in a conspiracy of sorts with capitalists from allied countries like the United States to damage the country of Germany. And you saw that in that political cartoon that we looked at about the Young Plan back in chapter 5. So those were basically these objectives. So it's pretty much clear that in order to achieve these objectives, there would have to be some sort of conflict. There's no way that Hitler and the Nazi Party could have achieved these peacefully. The first step that Hitler and the Nazi Party would have to take to achieve these objectives would be to first control the country of Germany itself, and then work its way outwards into foreign policy issues. So you can see towards the bottom of 112 how the Nazi Party began to try to do this. In November of 1923, there was an incident called the Munich Beer Hall Putsch, which Putsch is the German word for coup. And basically what they were trying to do is to seize political power in Germany and to eliminate any type of political competition. This attempt failed and Hitler was put into prison. It was in that prison sentence that Hitler wrote his very famous autobiography, Mein Kampf, which means My Struggles. And so he wrote about his life, but also his philosophy and goals for what he wanted to see accomplished in the country of Germany. It definitely had a lot of racist elements to it, and also the idea that Germany should be controlled by a strict authoritarian rule, and of course he wanted to be that person. But probably the biggest significance of Mein Kampf was the idea that he promoted as Lebensraum, which means living space for the German population. And going back to the Treaty of Versailles, the territories had been taken from Germany after World War I, and he not only wanted to regain those, but to spread out across the continent of Europe, specifically into Eastern Europe and into Russia, to have more living space for the German race, which he felt was superior. If you look at that quote from Mein Kampf on 112, it says, "Only an adequate large space on this earth assures a nation of freedom of existence. We must hold unflinchingly to our aim, to secure for the German people the land and soil to which they are entitled." So that definitely shows there his feelings of what the German people deserved, and that would mean that he would have to regain what was taken in the Treaty of Versailles and then some. So when we look at later on the Germans signing an agreement with the Russians, to Hitler that was just a temporary thing. His ultimate goal was to conquer all of Eastern Europe, including Russia, to have this living space, this Lebensraum, for the German people. Mein Kampf is seen by most historians to not just be an autobiography, but basically a step-by-step plan of what Hitler was intending to do. If you look at the bottom of 112 and top of 113, you can see these different stages that were pretty much outlined in Mein Kampf. The first stage being to terminate the Treaty of Versailles and then form an alliance with Britain and Italy, who he saw as key countries to be able to access certain things from, even though he didn't necessarily like them. The second stage would be war against France and her Eastern European allies, and that's easy to understand considering the feelings that the two countries had towards each other, if you remember the Ruhr issue back in 1923. And finally, the last stage would be the war with the Soviet Union, because of this idea of Lebensraum. There's been a lot of debate between historians as how much of this book can be seen as evidence of war planning. You can see these different historian debates at the top of 113. And so these types of statements of these stages that Hitler described are taken by some historians as clear evidence of his intentions for dominating the world, especially Eastern Europe. But other historians like A.G.P. Taylor sees this book as more wishful thinking and just what his ultimate dreams would be, but not necessarily a step-by-step plan that he intended to implement down the road. Hitler did write a second book that you can see at the bottom of the screen here and on page 113 called Zweites Buch, which is known as Secret Book, and he published it in 1928. And it's further evidence of what his ambitions were, and he pretty much takes the first book, Mein Kampf, and continues to develop the ideals and philosophy in that book in this second book. One difference in this second book is that he called out the United States in this one and basically said that in the 1930s, which was just 2 years away when he wrote the book, there would be this grand struggle between the forces of the United States and the combined forces of what he called a Greater Germany and the British Empire. So he actually saw that the British and the Americans would be fighting each other in the 1930s, which obviously didn't happen. But that's something he developed the idea for in the second book. And he also pointed out other certain people in the second book, such as Mussolini, and his anger towards a Chancellor of Germany, Stresemann, which was the guy who was in power during the Ruhr crisis. He felt like the most German politicians, even the ones that hated the Treaty of Versailles, were too limited in their thinking, that they didn't embrace this idea of Lebensraum. Let's take a look next at how Hitler came to power. We watched a video in class that kind of briefly outlined how that happened. In the 1920s, back in Chapter 4, we discussed that there were some points where things seemed to be looking up. The Locarno era with the Locarno Conference and some of those other treaties like the Kellogg-Briand Pact. Obviously, some of these were naive and were good on paper but not necessarily practical. But there was this false sense of hope that the League of Nations could promote international cooperation and collective security. And then the Great Depression hit. And that is something that definitely sped up Hitler's rise to power. Whether or not he would be able to do that without the Great Depression is debatable, but we know for sure that it definitely assisted him in his rise to power. The Great Depression hit Germany particularly hard. If you look at the graph on 113, you can see the rise in unemployment and corresponding with the popularity of the Nazi Party. As more people became unemployed in Germany, they looked for political parties that promised them relief, the Nazi Party being the most vocal of those. And so more and more Nazi seats were won in the Reichstag, which was the German parliament. A lot of people believe that Hitler could crush the Treaty of Versailles. The politicians in Germany at the time, the more conservative ones that weren't as vocal in or as radical in what they were wanting for the country or the Treaty of Versailles, they wanted Hitler to kind of be on their side, so they allowed him, to have an entrance into politics. He did win elections legally, but even the president, von Hindenburg, appointed him chancellor because he thought that he could control Hitler, which he was definitely wrong in that thinking. But with Hitler kind of going along with this until he could gain complete control over Germany, he allowed himself to be viewed as someone who could be subdued and worked with. And then once he got the top spot in Germany, he instituted a totalitarian state. When Hitler became Chancellor of Germany, he then tried to implement his idea of eliminating political opposition. You saw in the video the Night of Long Knives, in which many political opponents to Hitler were killed. And you can see that on page 114, that between 1933 and 34, he was able to get the cooperation of the army and the industrialists who thought that he could bring rearmament to the country, which would provide jobs and would allow the army to retrain and to gain power. And that's when Hitler was able to institute a totalitarian state under the Nazi Party, because at this point he had complete control. He had eliminated his opposition. He had gained the trust of the people because they felt he could eliminate the Treaty of Versailles and restore Germany's international prestige. And many saw him as the answer to the problems of the Great Depression. We're going to finish this recording of how Hitler decided to go about the revising, or the elimination, we should say, of the Treaty of Versailles. When he came to power in Germany, he pretty much did things that were consistent with his ideas of race and space, the idea of racial purity of the Aryan race, and this idea of living space that we've mentioned called Lebensraum. So many of his speeches and the propaganda that we see of Hitler were geared on those two themes. So between 1933 and 35 are the years that he went about destroying the Treaty of Versailles. And he first started with reparations and announced in 1933 that Germany just would not resume payments of these reparations, cut and dry, that they weren't going to continue this. Additionally, he made his intentions to rearm pretty clear. He was able to increase military spending 5 times from what it had been. So his idea was basically to create a German economy that would provide the industrial backing for the military. And you can see a graph and a chart of this on page 115 at the top of how much more spending was geared towards the military. He withdrew Germany from the League of Nations in 1933. They had been admitted in 1926. He then signed a 10-year non-aggression pact with Poland in 1934 just so that he could temporarily secure his eastern border. It gave the impression that his intentions were peaceful towards many countries who didn't really know what he was set about doing. He tried an Anschluss with Austria, which was unsuccessful at that time, but later he did achieve it. The Chancellor of Austria was murdered in that attempt. But Hitler decided to hold off on fully annexing Austria into Germany for the time being. And he was able to use a plebiscite vote in the Saar, which was an area that was supposed to be under League control, where the citizens voted to reunite with Germany as propaganda for his goals. He finally announced compulsory military service as well.